Hello and welcome to the TorontoWebsiteDeveloper.com. I am Peter Jaworski, the Toronto website developer specializing in Drupal. And in this fifth video tutorial of our second series on creating an e-commerce site using Drupal and Ubercart, we're going to continue looking at our theme development. So in the previous video tutorial we used Omega and we created our own sub-theme. Now we're going to go ahead and look at some of the modules that we downloaded in doing that, specifically the Delta module and the Context module. But before we do that, we're going to look at the appearance settings of our theme. And I should just reference for you, if you haven't gone ahead and already downloaded the modules, you're going to want to go to drupal.org/project/delta, grab that module, and then also go to drupal.org/project/context. You'll see it's linked to here on the Delta page, and you're going to want to go ahead and grab that module as well. You're going to want to make sure that they're enabled, so if we head over to modules, you'll just see if I scroll down, hopefully I don't miss it. Here's context. I've got context enabled, I've got context layouts, context UI. And then if you go down to theme, I believe it is, theme settings or something along those lines, theme tools, I've got Delta API enabled, Delta blocks, Delta color, Delta UI. I won't actually be looking at Delta color, but you can always have that enabled if you like to check it out. Now we'll go over to the appearance, settings, and sub-theme DrushX. That was the last theme, sub-theme that I created. So whatever your sub-theme is called, you're going to go to that. So appearance, settings, the name of your sub-theme. Now the purpose of this video tutorial is not to explain every specific option available to you with context and Delta and your theme. Rather, what I want to do is introduce you to the concepts, the overall broad structure of these modules in your theme, so that you understand what we're doing and how to do it, and then you can apply that to your specific requirements of your site. Obviously every site's going to be different, so I just wanted to walk you through the high level stuff so you understand how to do this on your own. So if you have any specific questions, make sure to leave a comment on YouTube or my site, and I'll be sure to get back to you. And then as always, as this is supported by the Ubercart team, check out ubercart.org/forums or drupal.org/forums, and you can always post questions there. So to get into this, the meat of the actual video tutorial, we'll cover three things: your actual theme settings, Delta, and then context. So let's look at the theme settings now. So because you've built a sub-theme off of Omega, you should have these settings here available to your sub-theme. These are actually provided by Omega, the info file. Remember we looked, it was pretty extensive, and what that provided was these different settings here for your specific sub-theme. The first one being the grid settings. So if you remember, the grid, we talked about it in the previous video tutorial where we saw all these pink columns. This is referred to as the grid, right? And you can turn those off and turn them on. And so if we go back to the actual theme settings here, we can see that the grid system is based on 960. So that's pretty common in development. It's 960 pixels wide. But you can also choose fluid, and fluid will just expand your content and shrink it back in, right? It's a little bit different from responsive, which we also have the ability to use using Omega. And what responsive does, it will actually change elements based on the page width, so the pixel size of your site. And this is typically used in mobile development so that you can create one site, change some CSS, and that site will look differently and reposition things based upon the browser that a person is using. So it'll look to see if they're on a regular desktop browser, or laptop browser rather, or they're using a mobile browser or a tablet browser, right? So we can enable a responsive grid here, so we've got that checked off. And we can also look at the viewpoint metadata properties for iOS, Apple devices, or Android devices. That's beyond the scope of this tutorial, so I'm not really going to touch on it. So I'm actually just going to check that off. And you'll see here I've got the layout settings for the different primary layouts that I have, right? So normal is actually going to apply to 740, right, to max width of 800. And what this will do is it's going to be, this is our narrow layout, right? So our narrow layout is going to be mid-width of 740 by 800, right? And this looks like it's going to be an orientation of landscape. So these are the actual media queries that will be put into your CSS, depending upon what type of media tag that the site is getting back. So the normal one is here, what I was trying to flag to you, and this will look at 980, right, by 1024. So this is my typical desktop browser that I'm using here. And then again, wide, anything bigger than 1220. So this is if somebody's got a huge screen, like a 27-inch monitor. And then obviously fluid layout, you can go ahead and use that as well. And then you can apply that to certain sizes. You could always change these up to do specific different things, and you can also add new ones in the info file, and there's documentation on that, so we're not really going to take a look at that. But the primary layout is obviously going to be a normal, because that's what most people are visiting my site with, but that might be different for you if you have a mobile specific site, so you can always change that up. So that's specifically the grid settings. We'll take a look at the zone and region configuration, and it might look like there's a lot here, but I'm going to break it down for you. So essentially we have these different sections, right? And sections are what Omega is referring to. So we've got the header section, the content section, and then the footer section, right? So you can think of those as kind of like the top of your page, the middle of your page, and then the bottom of your page. And within those sections, we've got all of these different zones. And so again, if we go back to the front page here and we take a look at, we've got this, what would be referred to as like this user zone, this branding zone, this menu zone, this header zone, right? And so when we go back over to this area, we can see all of those corresponding. We've got the user zone, branding zone, menu zone, header zone. But we also had all these different areas inside that. So those are actually what Omega refers to as regions, right? And this is actually the Drupal term. It's actually regions themselves, and they apply to the different sections that you have on your site where you can apply blocks. And so Omega is pretty powerful in that they provide you just a ton of regions. And the reason why that's powerful is because it allows you to have flexibility in where you're going to position things on your site. So really customize the look and feel. And so before we step into the regions, we'll look at the configuration for the actual zone. So these settings are pretty straightforward. I don't find you ever need to play with them too much, but just at a high level, you're going to see provide full wrapper around this zone. So that's just, you're going to have the actual div, and then you're going to have this wrapper inside of that, and then the actual content. That's kind of nice because then you can specifically change margins and that kind of thing. And we'll look at that kind of stuff when we're doing CSS. But I guess more importantly, whether or not you want to force this zone to be rendered. So if you do, that will always be an area there, regardless if you have content in that. So it would just be rendered blank if you force the render to be zone, or sorry, the zone to be rendered. And then obviously you can customize the positioning, but we're not going to be talking about that here. So the section, what this refers to is what we're looking up here, header section. So you'll see we've got 3 sections. This is in the header, the footer, the content. Right, so you can move this zone to a different area, right, and obviously start repositioning things, which is kind of nice. The weight is relative to the other zones in this section. So here we're looking at the user zone, and it's got a weight of 1, but if I look at the branding zone configuration, it's got a weight of 2. So the user zone is going to be rendered before the branding zone, right? Obviously lighters float up to the top, so that's what that refers to. The column count refers to how wide this zone is going to be. So we're using a 12 column width, so this is going to take the entire column, or sorry, the entire width of our page. And then the primary region, again, I don't know that you'd ever have to use those, but you can actually define which one's primary. The nice thing here is you can add specific zone classes, so if you have certain CSS, maybe you got a style sheet from a designer and you need to implement that, you can go ahead and add zone classes, so the zone refers to the user, or you can apply to the wrapper, and that wrapper is what we applied here, so you can put in some additional CSS without actually having to go into any PHP and do that yourself in a theme setting, so that's kind of nice. I think you'll appreciate that more as you get involved in Drupal. Now the regions themselves. So these are actually kind of the specific areas where you can place blocks, right? So we'll look at user bar first. And again, you can force this to be rendered so that it will always show up regardless if it has content. It'll be hidden if it doesn't have content. Now the zone refers to where it's actually going to be placed, right? So we can see that this user bar first is being placed in the zone, but you can always change that up. And the prefix, what this means is how many columns, how many spaces in front of this region are we going to place. So right now I'm putting 0, so it'll just go right up to the side. But you could put in 1 column to have it spaced in, and then you could provide the width to determine how wide it's going to be, and then you can do a suffix. So how much area beside it at the end of it do you want that to have, right? So you could put a 1 column in front, the actual content, 1 column at the end, and then it would be spaced out wherever it is. Again, the weight is relative to the other region, right? So this user bar first is going to be rendered first, and this user bar second is going to be rendered second, which is pretty intuitive. And if we go back to our site, we'll see that actually here, user bar first, user bar second. And remember, we saw how wide this was. I think it was 8, and the other one's 4, right? So a total of 12. So they take up the full width combined. So those are the configurations and the regions. It's pretty much straightforward for every section of here. So the content section, the footer section, every other region and zone is all going to be configured the same way. So I guess the one thing that I should flag for you is if you do not want a region rendered, you can go ahead and put that in the none, and then that will not be rendered. It will not be included in your page. And there are specific reasons why you might want to do that, and we'll look at one when we're actually walking through the Delta module. which is coming up pretty soon. So debugging, again, what this is, you can kind of section these off into these two settings. So enable the debugging blocks for selected roles, right? So whether or not here I have this ability to choose blocks, right? And then the other one is whether or not that's set by default, right? And then the third one is the grid, whether or not I can check out the grid, and whether or not that's set by default. So that's how you turn that kind of stuff off. The one thing I do want to flag for you here is the roles. Right now we have anonymous users being able to see this debugging information, and you may not want that if you're on a live site. So see here, I'm actually logged in. I'm actually on the site from an anonymous browser, so I'm not logged in, but I still have this ability to control the grid and the blocks. So you might want to turn that off depending upon if your site is live. Now the actual libraries, again, these media queries, that's related to mobile, or rather responsive web development, and that's where it checks the actual screen size. And formalize, I wouldn't worry about that too much. The equal heights actually takes the blocks and makes them equal height, so you don't have these different wide ones. And again, that's site specific, so it's up to you if you want to turn that on or turn it off. The toggle styles, this is pretty neat. I specifically like this because you can control your CSS and make sure it doesn't get too bulky. And so what this does is it'll look at all the style sheets that are available to your site, and you can check them on or off, right? And so specifically using Omega and creating a subtheme, you get all of these different CSS style sheets that are available to you. Reset, this is pretty common. What this does is if you have a site and you're looking at it in a browser, typically there's some CSS that's default to that, so different margins, paddings, that kind of thing. This just resets it all to 0 so that you have a nice blank slate to work from. Mobile, obviously for mobile browsers, we have some specific CSS for that, and that's related to the responsive theming. Then you've got Alpha that provides some stuff, and some text styles, branding styles, and that kind of thing. Just stuff to get you to a nice, clean area to begin with, right? And you can always override those with your global, and this global is what Omega provides you to put your own CSS in. And again, we'll be talking about that in a later video tutorial. Kind of nice here is the ability to disable other theme sheets or theme style sheets. So these are what come from modules that we've got enabled. So you'll see there are a lot of UberCart theme sheets, theme style sheets, but you can also disable a whole bunch more. So that's kind of nice. And then lastly, we can toggle advanced elements, and these are specifically related to elements that are displayed on a page. So the first few messages, action links, and tabs, I don't think you'd ever want to disable. If you're administering your site, those are pretty helpful, especially messages. I would say don't ever disable that. But then you also have the breadcrumb, the page title, and the feed icons. Breadcrumb's nice for accessibility, but I mean, if you're on my site, you notice I don't use it. I really should be using it. Page title is kind of nice because you can always render that in specific areas that you want. What Omega does is it actually puts it in the page, and then everything comes after that, and there are certain times you might not want that. So you could always manipulate that yourself if you turn that off. And then feed icons is a great one. This sometimes comes up if you're on like a taxonomy term that has a default RSS feed for it. You get this little icon there, and you don't necessarily want that. You can just check that off, and you don't get these feed icons, which is kind of nice. This elements to hide them via CSS. This is nice for SEO purposes. You might not necessarily want your site name or site slogan showing up all the time, but again, it's nice text for a search engine to find, especially because it's rendered near the top of the page. So you can hide it. Search engine will find it, but users don't typically see it. So that's why you might want to hide some of those. So those are specific settings that come from Omega that will be part of your sub-theme. The other thing, obviously, just like any theme, is you can toggle these actual displays for these elements that come default with Drupal themes, right? So logo, site name, site slogan, those kind of things. And then you've got your site logo and your site shortcut settings. So once you have all that set up, that's how your site will be kind of structured at a macro level. Now, as I mentioned, we have Delta and we have context installed. And what Delta allows us to do is to change these specific settings in certain circumstances or situations. And so we'll walk through one of those. But it's kind of like the idea, if you have a product page, you want it to look a little bit different from the rest of your page and how it's structured with sidebars and that kind of thing, we can go ahead and change that up. We could also not render the breadcrumb for whatever reason, do a whole bunch of stuff. So rather than me talk about it at a high level, let's go ahead and we'll add Delta. So appearance, Delta, add. And we're going to give this a name. So the human readable name is going to be page, we'll say product, pages, no sidebar. I don't know, that's a terrible name, but it's more of a description. So rendering a product page without any sidebars. right? And again, you can choose your actual theme. So we could do a context and use a different theme, right? Set different things up if we wanted to. I don't know why we would do that, but we could if we wanted to. The parent template, this chooses another template to actually build off of. And so because I don't have another one, this is my first one, that's why I get none. And I'm going to override all the values. And the reason why I do that is because I want this to be the base to work from other templates. And I found that if I didn't override all the values, sometimes my settings weren't saved. So when I was testing this out, it didn't work properly. So override all values, go ahead and save that. Okay, great. Now you're going to be taken back to the actual listing of your Delta. So we'll go ahead and we'll hit configure. And this will take us in, and this looks like our theme settings pages. It's the exact same setup, but these will be specifically to the Delta template. That's why we get this message here that says we're editing the Delta template, so that we know that we're not actually editing the theme. And so we can go ahead and change any settings that we have previously set to settings that will be specific to some type of context that we're going to react to. And I'll explain what a context is. But essentially what I'd like to do is, right now I've got my site set up so it's got two sidebars. Sidebar, content, sidebar. But when a person's on a product page, I just want them only to have that product information in front of them. I don't want them distracted with anything else. I just want them to make that purchase. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to remove from the content section the actual sidebars. And I do that by going into content. I know that the regions are rendered, sidebar first and sidebar second, within content, within the content zone. So this sidebar first, remember I told you you can remove it by going to none. So the zone is now going to be none. Close that one up. Sidebar second, same thing. Zone is going to be none. I'm going to close that up. I could have changed anything here. I can go in, I can make sure that debugging is not available on these pages. I can change the toggle libraries that are available. I can change the CSS that's available. And I can also take off all of these different settings. Everything can be changed for your theme settings within this Delta. You can customize it to whatever extent you want to do that. So I've just removed the two sidebars. I'm going to save that configuration. So now I've got this Delta available to me, but I actually have to implement it somehow. And that implementation comes through the context module. So you're going to go to Structure, Context, and we're going to add a context. Now here again we have the option or the ability to provide a name, and it's actually a requirement, not an ability. So we'll just call this front page. Front page. We'll just call it front page. It's got to be machine readable, so no spaces, underscores are provided there, and it's got to be alphanumeric. And this tag is going to be, we'll refer to it as an Uber cart, I don't know, and then front, right? Because it applies to our front. And so this will check if we are on a, and actually we're not working on a front page, so product page. And so this isn't actually front page, this is product page, and we'll call this Uber cart product. Okay. And so that's the actual kind of macro stuff that we provide up at the top. But then we can get into these conditions and reactions. And these should be familiar to you because these are like rules. So certain things happen, certain reactions are going to happen. So our condition is going to be, let's take a look at the node type. But you'll see we've got all of these different conditions. So I'll walk you through kind of what those are so you have an understanding of how to use them. But just briefly we'll take a look at how to actually implement this. So I know that my node type has to be product or product kit for it to be a product page. And then my reaction is going to be Delta. I'm going to use a specific Delta setting, so this is going to be product pages, no sidebar, and I can go ahead and save this. Now what context is going to do is it's going to look at the product type that I'm on, or sorry, the node type that I'm on, and if I'm on product or product kit, it's going to use the Delta settings that I created. And so you'll see here, now I've got Super Saver, and I've got no sidebars, and this is set up terribly because I still have the large image. But here are my two sidebars, have them rendered on the front page, and if I go into Awesome Product, I don't have sidebars rendered. They're not actually showing up because that's how my Delta is set up. So that's why context is so powerful. You can do different things on different sections of your site looking at different conditions. Let's walk through some of what those conditions are. We'll go back into context and we'll go into edit and we'll just scroll down here and we'll look at some of the conditions. So this context, what you can do is you can build off of other contexts. So if a context is active, then enable this context. Obviously this being our first, we're not going to have that situation. The menu, we can actually look at the different menu selected items that are currently active and do different things based upon that. Again, I'm not going to go into full details on all of these or full examples. I just want to give you an idea of what you can do, and you can play around and figure out how to meet your needs. So taxonomy, obviously we can look at specific taxonomy terms and do certain things. We can go to the path Again, if we have our site structured so that paths build off of each other, we can always apply certain context to those paths, and we can always use a wildcard asterisk, just like if we were setting up blocks. Site-wide context, apply this always to be active if we want to do a certain thing. And then taxonomy term, if we're looking at specific term pages, this is different from the taxonomy, but if we're looking at a term page, we can do certain things. Obviously, we can look at user roles, so if somebody logged in, then do certain things. And this could be a reason, I don't know, rather than incentivize the user to sign up to the newsletter because they're already in there, we could replace that with something else. User page, again, if they're looking at a certain user page, we can do certain context. And then we've got views, the ability to work off of views. And there are also other plugin modules for context that you could use to build off of that as well. So that's pretty neat. Again, just like rules, you have your kind of input, and then you're going to have your output, right? So our reaction is our output, and so we could render blocks in different ways depending upon some of these settings. So we could take this feed icons, and we could put this in the sidebar first for whatever reason. The other thing is for the breadcrumb. We can go ahead and set the breadcrumb to active for a certain area based on the path that we're looking at. We can also go ahead with menu, and we can do certain reactions to that, right? So we can always put active menu class on some specific part of the menu depending upon what page this is in. And one of the reasons why I've used that in that situation is because somebody's had a page linked to and do different menus, and it gets weird when you click on it. It takes you to different sections of the site. It just re-renders pages. It looks really weird. So I can use a context to set it active in certain areas to make sure it's always consistent. So debugging, I mean, that's pretty straightforward. But then we've also got this regions. We can actually disable regions. So these should all look familiar to you. We can disable them based on certain, I guess, conditions, right? And then lastly, we can go ahead and theme the page and theme the HTML. And what this allows us to do is actually provide a section title, so we can do different titles for different areas based on conditions, and we can actually put in CSS for this as well, right? And then looking lastly here, we can go theme HTML, and you can provide some CSS here up at the top in the HTML tag. And what that looks like is, if you inspect this element, we'll see up here, sorry, we're looking at these. These are all the CSS for the class, and so we can actually change that and add in new ones without actually having to do any PHP work or theming work. So that's pretty neat. It's all from within this UI. So that's the theme settings, the Delta module, and the context module. Hopefully this made sense. I mean, there's a lot to carry on here, and we could have done, you know, easily a 4 or 5 part video tutorial series on just these modules themselves. If this is interesting to you and you want to go even further, the display suite provides a lot of more micro management for your site, so you could always check that out, and there are a lot of video tutorials and documentation on that. So hopefully this helped. If it did, please leave me a thumbs up, leave a comment, let me know if you have any questions. Again, YouTube or my site, and always check out ubercart.org/forums and drupal.org/forums. So we'll see you in the next video tutorial. Thanks again for watching.